The lug nut wouldn't turn, and Zora Bennett had already decided she wasn't going to ask anyone for help. Rain came down in sheets across Route 9, the kind that turned headlights into smears and made the world feel like it was being erased 1 mile marker at a time. She was crouched at the rear wheel of her own car, jacket soaked through to the shoulder blades, breath fogging in front of her face even though it wasn't cold. Just wet enough, just late enough. Just enough that her body had started shaking before her mind admitted she was tired. She hadn't planned on stopping tonight. She'd planned on getting home, peeling off these boots and staring at the ceiling until the numbers in her head, rent, parts, the second month behind on the shop's insurance, quieted down enough to let her sleep. Then the headlights ahead of her had done something wrong. They'd stopped moving. Zora eased off the gas without deciding to. Some instinct older than thought, the kind mechanics develop after enough nights on dead roads, told her a car that isn't moving in weather like this isn't parked. It's stranded. And stranded, out here, with no streetlights for 6 miles in either direction, was its own kind of emergency. She pulled onto the shoulder behind it, engine idling, wipers slapping uselessly against the downpour, and sat there for 4 full seconds deciding whether to get out. That was the thing about Zora nobody ever put into words right. Not even her. She wasn't fearless, she just had a very short list of things she was more afraid of than getting out of a warm car into cold rain for a stranger, and leaving someone stuck was near the top of it. She got out. The man was already on the ground when she reached him, sitting hard against the rear tire of a sedan that cost more than her shop's entire equipment inventory, one hand pressed flat against his ribs, the other holding the remains of an umbrella that the wind had turned inside out and then abandoned entirely. His coat, dark leather, the kind that didn't come from any store Zora had ever walked into, was soaked black across the shoulders. "Sir," she crouched in front of him, rain running off her chin. "Hey, can you hear me?" He looked up at her slow, like the motion cost him something. His eyes were pale, unfocused, in a way that made her stomach tighten. Not drunk, unfocused. Something else. "Tire," he managed. "Blue." I pulled over, and then he stopped. Started again. "I don't know why I'm on the ground." That last part scared her more than anything else he'd said. Okay, I've got you." She kept her voice level. The same voice she used on customers who came in panicking about a check engine light. The same voice that made frightened people believe, for just long enough, that somebody in the situation knew what they were doing. "What's your name?" "Warwick." A pause, like the word had cost him something to say. Just, "Warwick's fine." She noted, without deciding to note it, that he hadn't given a last name. Filed it away the way she filed away every small thing that didn't quite fit, a habit from years of diagnosing problems that lied to you on the surface. His phone was in his lap, screen dark, battery long gone. Hers had 1 bar out here, enough for a call that might drop halfway through. She made it anyway, gave the dispatcher the mile marker, said possible medical, conscious, disoriented, and didn't wait for reassurance she wouldn't believe regardless. The callback came 90 seconds later. She answered with the phone wedged against her shoulder, both hands still on Warwick, keeping him upright. "Ma'am, be advised, our closest unit is tied up on a multi-vehicle out on the interstate, and county's only got the 1 truck running tonight because of the storm. We're looking at 25, maybe 30 minutes before anyone reaches you." 30 minutes. She looked down at Warwick. His breathing had changed in just the time it took her to hear that sentence, shorter, faster, a rhythm that didn't belong to a man who'd been coherent enough to describe his own blowout 4 minutes ago. "Copy that," she said, and hung up before the dispatcher could hear the decision already forming behind it. 30 minutes was a number for a man having a bad night. It was not a number for whatever this was. Then she looked at the tire. Shredded. Rim dug half an inch into the gravel shoulder. Whoever had been driving hadn't slowed down before it went. They'd been going fast enough that the blowout had nearly put them in the ditch. She looked back at Warwick. Grey around the mouth. Getting worse, not better. "An ambulance is coming," she told herself. "You don't have to fix the car, you just have to keep him talking." But she thought about the 6 miles of nothing in either direction, the kind of rural stretch where an ambulance eater could stretch to 25 minutes on a clear night, and worse than that in this. She thought about how fast disoriented could become something with a different name entirely. She was already moving toward her trunk before she'd finished deciding. Jack. Tire iron. The spare he probably had, bolted under the frame like every car built after 2010. She could have this wheel swapped in under 10 minutes if the lug nuts cooperated. And if they got him stable enough to move, her car, old, ugly, reliable, could close the gap to Route 9's hospital exit faster than waiting on dispatch to fight through the storm. She didn't ask if that was overstepping. She just worked. The first 3 nuts came off clean. The fourth had rusted itself into the rim, like it had personally decided to make this harder than it needed to be, and Zora threw her whole weight against the tire iron, rain running down her wrist into her sleeve, teeth gritted, until it finally screamed loose. Behind her, Warwick made a sound, not quite words. She turned fast enough to see him slumping sideways, catching himself against the car door at the last second, breath coming shallow and wrong.
Hey, stay with me, I'm almost done.
She dropped the tire iron, went to him instead, got an arm under his shoulders to keep him upright. Up close, under the weak glow of his own hazard lights, she saw something tucked half out of his coat's inner pocket, a laminated card, security badge shaped, torn clean across the middle. Only a few words on the surviving half were still legible, and only because the rain hadn't gotten to that pocket yet. In case of emergency, do not contact. The rest was gone, torn off. On purpose, from the clean edge of it, not an accident, not where. Zora looked at it for exactly 1 second longer than she meant to. Then Warwick's eyes rolled back, just slightly, just enough, and whatever question was forming in her mind got shoved aside by the only one that mattered right now. No, she said, low, mostly to herself. Not tonight. Not on my watch. She finished the tire in under 2 minutes after that. She'd never remember exactly how. Got him into her passenger seat, with the belt across his chest, and his head tipped back, and pulled onto the empty highway going faster than she'd ever driven in the rain in her life. In her rearview mirror, headlights appeared behind her. Not the ambulance. Something else, high beams, close together, moving with a kind of formation that a single-stranded driver's family wouldn't have. She didn't have time to wonder about it. Not yet. The waiting room at Cedar Ridge Regional smelled like burnt coffee and hand sanitizer, and Zora had been sitting in it long enough that the plastic chair had stopped feeling uncomfortable and started feeling like part of her body. Her jacket was still wet. She hadn't noticed, until now, sitting still, how badly she was shaking, not from cold anymore, just from the aftershock of having driven a stranger's blood pressure crisis down a flooded highway at 70 miles an hour. Her hands wouldn't quite stop trembling around the paper cup of vending machine coffee she wasn't drinking. She told the intake nurse everything she knew, which wasn't much. Found him on the shoulder of Route 9. Name's Warwick. That's all I've got. The nurse had looked at her for half a second too long. Not suspicious, just curious, in a way Zora didn't have the energy to interpret, before pulling him back through the double doors. That had been 40 minutes ago. She thought about calling the shop, telling Marcus she'd be late opening tomorrow, and then remembered it was already past midnight, which meant tomorrow had already started. She thought about her own car, still running rough on that spare tire back home. She thought about the torn card in Warwick's coat pocket, do not contact, and made herself stop thinking about it. Because thinking about it wasn't going to make it make sense. A young nurse in blue scrubs came through the doors around one, glanced at the clipboard, glanced at Zora, and went very still. It was brief. A held breath, a flicker crossing her face, like she'd recognized something she wasn't supposed to recognize. Then it was gone, replaced by professional neutrality so fast Zora almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. Are you with Miss? The nurse checked the clipboard again, like she needed the excuse to look away from Zora's face. With the patient in Bay 4? I'm the one who brought him in, that's all. Right. The nurse's pen paused over the form. Of course. She didn't finish whatever sentence had been forming behind her eyes. She just turned and walked back through the doors faster than she needed to. Zora sat with that for a while. That's the kind of thing you notice and can't do anything with. A reaction with no explanation attached. She filed it next to the torn card, the missing last name, the coat that cost more than her truck, and told herself none of it mattered as long as he was breathing. At 2:15, a doctor came out and told her he'd stabilized, some kind of cardiac irregularity, brought on, they suspected, by dehydration and stress compounding, an existing condition. Nothing catastrophic. He'd be kept overnight for monitoring. And then, almost as an afterthought, the doctor added, "He's asking for you, if you're willing." She hadn't expected that. She went anyway. Bay 4 was dim, curtain half drawn, monitors chirping their quiet, steady rhythm. Warwick looked smaller against the hospital bed than he had on the shoulder of the highway. Smaller and older, and for the first time since she'd found him, genuinely afraid. "You didn't have to stay," he said. His voice had steadied some, but his eyes hadn't. "Wanted to make sure you were still breathing before I went home to sleep on it." The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile. Then it fell away. "I need to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to actually hear the question before you answer it." She waited. "Please don't tell anyone my name. Not the hospital paperwork, not—" He stopped, started again, quieter. "Not anyone. Not yet." It wasn't gratitude. She'd expected gratitude. The kind people performed at you when you'd done something for them, a little embarrassed, a little relieved. This was something else entirely. This was a man asking her to carry a weight for him without telling her what it weighed. "That's a strange thing to ask somebody you met 3 hours ago," she said. "I know." He wasn't defending it. He just let it sit there, true and unexplained. "I know exactly how strange it is. I'm asking anyway." Zora looked at him for a long moment, really looked, the way she looked at an engine that was telling her something was wrong without telling her what. Something about the request scared her more than the tire had. More than the drive. Fear, she'd learned a long time ago, usually came wrapped in politeness. His was, "Okay," she said finally. Not because she understood, because he'd asked her plainly, and plain honesty was the only currency she knew how to trade in. "Your business is your business." Something in his face loosened, not relief exactly. Closer to disbelief that she'd actually said yes. "Thank you," he said, and this time it did sound like gratitude. Just late, and quieter than she expected. She left an hour later, promising to check on him in the morning, and drove home on the spare tire through streets gone empty and silver with rain-slick light. Her house was dark when she pulled up, same as always. Same porch light burned out for 3 weeks now that she kept meaning to fix. Except tonight, there was a car parked at the curb across the street. Black, windows tinted past legal. Engine idling low enough that she'd have missed it if the street hadn't been so silent. She sat in her driveway a moment, keys still in the ignition, watching it in her rearview mirror. It didn't move. It didn't turn its lights off. It just sat there, facing her house, like it had been waiting for her to come home. Zora thought about the torn card in Warwick's coat pocket. "Do not contact." She thought, contact who? She went inside and locked the door, which had never once in 4 years of living on this block felt like something she needed to do. If you're enjoying the story so far, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Zora woke to the smell of coffee she hadn't made. For a half second, still half inside sleep, that felt normal. The kind of morning where her mother used to be up before her, humming over the stove. Then her eyes opened all the way and she remembered she lived alone, and the coffee smell had a source that wasn't hers. She came down the stairs in yesterday's socks and found her kitchen exactly as she'd left it. Empty. Quiet. The coffee smell wasn't inside the house at all. It was drifting through the screen door from outside, from a line of idling engines that hadn't been there when she'd finally fallen asleep at 4. She counted from the window before she opened the door. 4 SUVs. Then, as she watched, a 5th turned onto the block and eased in behind the others, headlights cutting off in perfect sync, like the whole convoy had rehearsed it. Her hand found her phone on the counter, without her telling it to. Marcus. 3 rings before he picked up, groggy. Zora, it's not even 7. Are you seeing anything weird outside your place? A pause. She heard him get up, heard blinds rattle. "No. Why, you good?" "I don't know yet." She hung up before he could ask again because she didn't have an answer that wouldn't sound insane out loud. By the time she'd pulled on real clothes, there were 8. She stood on her own porch in the grey early light, arms crossed against the morning chill, and watched doors open on both sides of the street, in a motion so coordinated it looked choreographed. Men and women in dark, plain clothes stepped out. Not uniforms, exactly. but close enough to a uniform that nobody would mistake them for anything but professionals. They didn't approach. They just stood, positioned, watching the street, the way people watch for threats they already expect. One of them, a woman in a charcoal coat with her hair pulled back, tight enough to mean business, crossed toward the porch, alone. She stopped at the bottom step, hands visible, voice even. "Miss Bennett, my name is Priya Okafor. I'm with the Voss family office." A beat, like she was choosing the next words carefully. "Mr. Voss would like to speak with you, if you're willing." Zora's stomach dropped an inch before her brain caught up to why. "His name's Warwick," she said. "Careful, testing, Warwick Voss." Priya said it like it was obvious, like the whole world already knew, and only just then did Zora understand that maybe it was. "You may know the name. Voss Industrial. He's been—" Priya hesitated for the first time, and that hesitation was somehow worse than anything she'd said plainly. "He's been out of public view for some time. 2 years, in fact." Zora didn't move, didn't answer. Her thumb was already unlocking her phone behind her back, muscle memory faster than thought, and by the time she looked down at the search results, her hands had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the morning air. Warwick Voss, reclusive founder of Voss Industrial, presumed in seclusion following the death of his wife, Eleanor Voss, 2 years ago. Company under scrutiny amid ongoing leadership dispute. Last confirmed public sighting, 19 months ago. Photographs. A younger, sharper version of the man she'd hauled off wet pavement, shaking hands with people in suits, cutting ribbons, standing at podiums under his own name in letters 4 feet tall. Not stranded. Not lost. Missing. For 2 years. On purpose, if the tone of every article she scrolled through was any guide, vanished so completely that half of them speculated he might be dead, and speculated it with the casual cruelty of people writing about a stranger. She looked up at Priya. "He's been hiding. That's one word for it." Priya's face gave nothing away, but her voice had gone very quiet. "You found something a lot of people gave up looking for, Miss Bennett, whether you meant to or not." That was when it hit her, not as relief, the way she'd expected finding out who he was might feel, but as something closer to dread. She hadn't saved a stranded man on a rainy highway. She'd surfaced something, pulled a stone out of very still water, and had no idea yet what was underneath it. "Is he in danger?" she said. Not really a question. Priya's jaw tightened, just barely. "I'd rather explain that inside if you'll let us." Zora glanced past her at the line of vehicles, the small army of quiet, watching people who had apparently been ready to descend on a residential street at dawn, the moment their employer opened his eyes in a hospital bed and asked for her by name. Whatever this was, it hadn't been improvised. It had been waiting. "Give me a minute," Zora said, and stepped back inside, shutting the door on the porch full of strangers. She stood in her own kitchen, coffee she hadn't made growing cold on the counter, and made herself breathe. Then Priya's phone rang, muffled through the door, and Zora heard her voice change, not loud, but sharper, the professional calm cracking, just enough to leak urgency through the wood. "When?" A pause. "How long ago?" Another pause. Longer. And when Priya spoke again, it had dropped almost to a whisper, but the house was old, and the walls were thin, and Zora heard every word. "Move her inside. Now. And get someone on the east end of the block. If they know he's conscious, they'll know exactly where to look." Zora's hand froze on the doorframe. Somebody besides the family office, knew Warwick Voss was awake. And whoever that was, they weren't sending flowers. They moved Warwick into Zora's living room 40 minutes later, wrapped in a blanket that looked like it cost more than her couch, flanked by 2 security men, who filled the doorway like furniture nobody had asked for. He looked embarrassed by the fuss. That surprised her more than the SUVs had. "I'm sorry about this," he said, low, once Priya had stepped out to take another call on the porch. "About all of it. You didn't sign up for a siege." "No," Zora agreed. "I signed up for a flat tire." She sat across from him, in the one good armchair her mother had left her, arms crossed, not quite ready to be gentle yet. "You want to tell me what's actually happening, or am I supposed to keep guessing?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might dodge it again. Then he didn't. 2 years ago my wife died," he said. "Eleanor. We built the company together. I built the machines. She built the people who ran them. When she was gone, I found I couldn't sit in a boardroom and pretend either of those things mattered without her in the room. He looked down at his hands. So I stopped, quietly, told the board I needed time. Time turned into a year. A year turned into 2, and somebody decided 2 years was long enough to stop waiting. His eyes flicked up, sharp despite everything, and he didn't answer right away, just looked at her a moment longer than the question required. I fix cars for a living. Every problem's got a cause if you look long enough. She leaned forward. So who's outside my house that scared your security detail enough to move you inside at 7 in the morning? Before he could answer, a car door slammed outside, different from the low, disciplined thunk of the SUVs. Louder, angrier. A man's voice carried through the screen door, sharp with a kind of controlled panic Zora recognized from customers who'd just been quoted a repair bill they couldn't afford. Where is he? I want to see him right now. Priya's voice, low and firm, tried to slow him down and failed. The door opened without anyone knocking. He was younger than Zora expected, mid-30s, dressed like he'd left a meeting in the middle of it, tie loosened, jaw tight. He stopped 3 steps into the living room like he'd hit glass, staring at his father sitting upright on a stranger's couch, alive, awake, unmistakably back. Julian, Warwick said. Just the name. Careful, like handling something breakable. 2 years, Julian said. His voice cracked on the second word and he hated it. Zora could see him hate it. 2 years, and the first I hear you're alive is a security alert at 5 in the morning. I know what you didn't want. Julian's hands were shaking. You didn't want the company. You didn't want the board. You didn't want me, apparently, since I've spent 2 years running Voss Industrial into a restructuring vote that happens in 48 hours, because everyone assumed you weren't coming back. The room went very still. A vote for what? Warwick said quietly. To formalize what's already true. To transfer control permanently. Julian's jaw worked. I didn't ask for it. The board did. I let it happen. Because what was I supposed to do? Keep waiting for a ghost? Zora watched something move behind Warwick's face. Not anger. Something closer to recognition. The look of a man realizing his absence had cost more than he'd let himself imagine. That's who's been looking for you, Julian said, quieter now, aimed at his father, but landing on Zora too. Not just us. The vote's worth a great deal to a great many people, and some of them would very much prefer you stayed missing another 48 hours. He glanced at Zora properly for the first time, taking in the modest living room, the work boots by the door, the woman sitting across from his father like she belonged there. Which I assume is why there's a security detail parked on this stranger's street, instead of at a hospital where anyone could walk in. She's not a stranger, Warwick said. His voice had changed, steadier than Zora had heard it since the highway. Her name is Zora Bennett. She found me in a storm with a blown tire and a phone with no signal, and instead of driving past, she changed the tire herself and got me to a hospital before whatever was happening in my chest finished the job. He held Julian's eyes. In 2 years, you're the first person who's yelled at me. She's the first person who stopped for me. I think that tells you something about who's owed what around here. Julian didn't answer that right away. Something in his posture eased, just slightly. Not resolution, but the first crack in 2 years of armor. Warwick was quiet a moment, looking at his hands again, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped lower, like he was working something loose that had been stuck a long time. Do you know what every report about me this morning says? He asked. Zora shook her head. That I was found. He looked up at her. They all missed the important part. Which is, I wasn't found. A pause, and something in his face finally cracked open, plain and unguarded. I was saved. By someone who had every reason to keep driving and didn't. The room went quiet in a different way than before. Not tense now, just full. 48 hours, he said again, turning it over. Enough time. Enough time for what? To show up. He looked at Zora, and for a moment the boardroom and the SUVs and his son's exhausted anger all fell away, and it was just the two of them, the way it had been on the wet shoulder of Route 9. I've spent 2 years disappearing from every room that mattered, because I couldn't stand being in them without her. You reminded me what it looks like to show up for someone with nothing to gain from it. He drew a breath, and Zora could see it cost him something. I've approved projects that look like numbers on a presentation until I stood in your garage last night and realized every one of those numbers belonged to somebody. A family. A block. Somebody's whole life folded into a spreadsheet cell. Zora felt her pulse pick up, not with hope exactly, with wariness, the particular caution of someone who'd learned that big offers usually came with strings even bigger. I know you don't need anything from me, Warwick said. That's exactly why I'm asking. He glanced once at Julian, who was watching this exchange with an expression Zora couldn't quite read, something between suspicion and the beginning of something else. Then back to her. I have an offer for you, Miss Bennett. Not a thank you. Not a check I write and forget about by Tuesday. He leaned forward, and for the first time since the highway, something almost like his old certainty came back into his voice. I want you to... Outside, another car door shut, and Priya's voice rose sharply through the window, not the composed tone from that morning, but something closer to alarm. Warwick's head turned toward the sound. Whatever he'd been about to say died in his throat, the sentence left hanging in the air between them, unfinished. Warwick. Julian was already moving toward the window, phone to his ear, face going pale in the grey morning light. That's not our people. The man at the door wasn't dangerous. He was worse than dangerous. He was polite. Grey suit, leather portfolio, the particular calm of someone who'd done this exact thing to other families before. He introduced himself as counsel for the board, said he only needed a few minutes of Mr. Voss's time, and set a folder on Zora's coffee table like it belonged there. Julian read it before his father could. His jaw went tight. This is a competency affidavit. He looked up, disbelieving. They want him to sign that he wasn't of sound mind for the last 2 years. Backdated. He turned to the lawyer. You're not here to check on him. You're here to make sure the vote goes through clean, in case he tries to stop it. The lawyer didn't flinch. Mr. Voss has been out of contact for 2 years, under significant emotional distress. The board simply wants clarity before tomorrow's proceedings. Warwick hadn't moved from the couch. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it filled the room the way it must have once filled boardrooms without needing to be raised. I was disoriented on a highway in a storm, he said. I have never in 2 years been unable to recognize my own son, my own company, or my own conscience. Ask the doctors. Ask the woman who drove me to the hospital. He nodded once at Zora. Ask anyone who's spent an hour with me since Tuesday. I'll answer every question the board has. Tomorrow, in the room, in person. The lawyer's composure cracked half a degree. Not much, but enough. He'd clearly expected a frightened, disoriented old man, easy to manage. He was looking at someone else entirely. I'll relay that, he said, and left without the folder. Julian watched the door close, then looked at his father like he was seeing him for the first time in 2 years. You're actually going tomorrow. I am. Warwick's eyes found Zora's, and I'm hoping you'll come with me. That night, after the SUVs had thinned to 2 and the street had gone quiet again, Warwick asked Zora to sit with him on the porch. He'd brought something with him from the hospital. She hadn't noticed it until now, tucked in his coat pocket where the torn card used to be. A new card. Laminated, plain, his handwriting on it in careful block letters. In case of emergency, contact Zora Bennett. She stared at it longer than she meant to. After Eleanor died, he said, I tore the old one up. Not because I stopped caring what happened to me. Because I stopped believing it would matter to anyone if something did. He turned the card over in his fingers. You proved me wrong on the side of a highway in the rain. I'd like the record to reflect that, if you don't mind. She didn't say anything for a while, just sat with it, the weight of what he was actually telling her. Okay, she said finally. Same word she'd given him in the hospital. This time it meant something different. The boardroom the next morning was exactly the kind of room Zora had never set foot in. Glass walls, a table long enough to land a plane on. 20 faces that watched Warwick walk to the head of the table with an expression closer to suspicion than welcome. A woman near the far end, Regina Alsop, the nameplate read, Interim Chair, didn't wait for him to sit before she spoke. With respect, Mr. Voss, this board kept your company solvent for 2 years while you were unreachable. We have shareholders who need certainty, not a surprise appearance the morning of a scheduled vote. Murmurs of agreement moved down the table. Forgive me if grief doesn't excuse 2 years of silence to the people who trusted you. It doesn't, Warwick said. No defensiveness in it. You're right to be angry. I'd be angry too, if I was sitting where you're sitting. He let that land before he went on. But I'm not asking you to forgive 2 years. I'm asking you to look at the man in front of you right now and decide honestly whether he sounds incapable of running this company or whether it was simply easier to assume so while I wasn't in the room to argue otherwise. Another director, older, arms crossed, cut in. Convenient timing, showing up the day before the vote. I didn't choose the timing. Warwick's voice stayed even, but something steel-edged crept into it. A woman changed a tire in the rain and drove me to a hospital instead of leaving me on the side of a highway. If she hadn't, you'd be having this vote without me, in a coffin instead of a chair. I'd think carefully before calling that convenient. The room went quiet. Regina's jaw tightened, but she didn't push again. Zora, standing near the door, felt every eye in the room flick briefly toward her, and then away, not curiosity now. Something closer to reckoning. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He laid out, calmly, the last 2 years, his grief, his absence, and the plain fact that a company built by 2 people shouldn't be quietly signed away by one board's convenience while he was too broken to notice. Then he thanked the board for holding things together in his absence, publicly, generously, and asked Julian to stand beside him as co-chair going forward, not as a consolation, but because his son had earned it the hard way, alone. For 2 years no one had properly thanked him for. Julian hadn't expected to speak. Zora could see it in the way he hesitated before he stood, like the words had caught him off guard as much as anyone else in the room. I kept waiting for someone to tell me I was allowed to be angry at a dead woman's husband for disappearing, he said, quiet, not performing it for anyone. Nobody ever did. I had to decide on my own that keeping this place standing didn't mean I'd stop being his son. He looked at his father, not the room. I'm glad I don't have to keep choosing between those 2 things anymore. Nobody clapped. It wasn't that kind of room, but the silence that followed was a different silence than the one before it. Regina Alsop let it sit a moment longer, then folded her hands on the table. Then let's proceed, she said. Not warmth. Not surrender either. The clipped, professional acceptance of someone recalculating in real time and choosing not to make a show of it. It was, Zora would come to understand, the closest thing to respect this room offered anyone. The restructuring vote never happened. Something had loosened in the room since Julian sat down. The wariness hadn't vanished, but it had gone quiet, replaced by the particular attentiveness of people watching a decision get made honestly instead of managed. It was in that loosened air that Warwick asked the board to approve a permanent community reinvestment fund, run independently, starting with one working-class block outside the city that most of the room had never heard of and would soon not be able to stop hearing about. Nobody argued it the way they'd argued everything else that morning. Trust, once it starts moving back into a room, tends to keep moving. He didn't mention Zora by name in front of the room. That wasn't the story he was there to tell. He told her the rest of it privately, afterward, in the elevator down. I want you to run it, he said, finishing, at last, the sentence that had been interrupted twice now. Not because I'm paying you to, because you already know what a neighborhood like that needs better than anyone I could hire for the job. They stepped out into the lobby a few minutes later, and Zora stopped near the floor-to-ceiling windows facing the street. 20 stories down, the city was rain-washed and grey-gold in the late morning light, cars and umbrellas moving through it in small, unhurried streams. Ordinary people, living ordinary Tuesdays. None of them aware that a decision made 20 floors above them had just quietly changed the shape of a few thousand lives they'd never meet. She thought about her own street, about Marcus, about kids who hadn't been born yet, who'd grow up in a version of that block she couldn't fully picture yet. Then she went home, because the shop didn't run itself, and there was still a customer coming in at 4, and because she was starting to understand that customer at 4 and the fund 20 floors above the street were 2 ends of the same rope. One of them just happened to have a better view. 6 months later, Taylor and Bennett Auto. She kept her name on the sign, added nothing else to it, refused every version of the logo the marketing team sent over, had 4 new lifts, a training bay for the apprenticeship program. and a waiting room that still smelled faintly of coffee and rain on bad days, because something she wasn't interested in upgrading away. Marcus ran the floor most mornings now. Zora split her time between the shop and the fund's little office 2 blocks over, approving grants for people who reminded her, more often than she said out loud, of herself 4 years ago. On a Tuesday evening in October, closing up, headlights swung into the service lane. A young man, maybe 19, stood next to a car with a blown tire, rain starting to come down in that first uncertain way that meant it wasn't going to stop. "I'm sorry, I don't know if you're still open." "We're always open." Zora grabbed the jack off the wall without thinking twice. The same motion she'd made 100 times, the same motion that had once, on a night she still thought about, changed the whole shape of her life. A black SUV idled at the corner of the block, engine low, exactly where it had once sat like a threat. These days it just meant someone was checking in. She lifted a hand toward it without looking, a habit now, half wave, half thank you. Rain tapped softly against the hood as Zora tightened the last lug nut. The young man thanked her twice before driving off into the wet dark, taillights shrinking down the block. Some people wait their whole lives for someone to stop for them. Zora had learned, the hard way, that the waiting usually ends the moment somebody else decides not to keep driving. If this story reminded you that one small act of kindness can change a life forever, then you've already understood its message. Sometimes the greatest opportunities don't arrive with applause. They're standing quietly on the side of the road, waiting for someone willing to stop. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes kindness can change the world. Until next time, remember, the smallest decision you make today may become someone else's miracle tomorrow.